I have buried men I liked better than I'll ever say out loud, and I have watched a town turn its back on a family like it was closing a barn door against the cold. But I have only once, in 51 years of riding this stubborn country, seen a man stand in the road with everything he owned strapped to his two children's shoulders. A man with nothing left but the two small reasons he had to keep breathing. And I have never been able to put that morning down on paper without my hand going stupid on me. So I'm going to try now, not because anybody asked, because I'm getting old and the things you don't write down die twice. His name was Hesh. I didn't learn it for a long while, because at the start he was only the Apache to the men around me, said the way you'd say a thing you'd already decided not to feel anything about. He had a girl of about 11 and a boy of about 6. He had a dead wife he never once spoke of in my hearing. And by the time the leaves turned that year, he had something none of us did, a secret hole in the earth that the fire had spared, a cellar nobody living remembered. And inside it, the only thing standing between his children and the worst winter that valley would see in a generation. This is the story of how a man with nothing found a door in the ground, and what it cost him to keep it open. If you've ever been put out into the cold by people who used to call you neighbor, stay with me. You'll want to see how this one ends. See, the morning they threw Hesh out, I was leaning on a fence rail 200 yards off, pretending I had a reason to be there. I didn't. I'd ridden over from my own place under the excuse of buying back a horse the Cruz family had borrowed and never returned, but the truth was thinner than that. I'd heard the night before, in the back room of Doolin's store, that old Marcus Cruz had finally decided to put the Apache off the strip of bottomland his late daughter had let the man farm. I'd heard it the way you hear weather coming, low and certain, and not your business. And like a coward who calls himself careful, I went to watch. I keep a logbook, have my whole life. Whether calving the price of nails, who owes me what. My wife used to laugh at it before she passed, said I'd write down the second coming in the same small hand I used for you lost, coyote probably. Maybe she was right, but I had the book in my coat that morning and I'll tell you, I didn't write a word for 3 days after. Some things won't fit in a column. The light was the gray that comes before a cold front, all the color pressed out of the sky. There was frost in the shadows that the sun hadn't reached and wouldn't, not that low in the year. And in the road in front of the little daub stone house the man had built with his own hands, there stood Marcus Cruz, his 2 grown sons, and the county man with a paper. Hesh stood facing them. He wasn't a big man. I want to say that plain because the way it got told later, you'd think he'd been some giant they had to bring low. He wasn't. He was lean and weathered and quiet in the particular way of a man who has learned that quiet is the only ground nobody can take from you. He had his hat in his 2 hands, which I have never been able to forget, because a man holds his hat like that at a funeral, or when he is asking for something he already knows he won't get. Behind him, half in the doorway, were the children. The girl had her brother's hand. She was the kind of thin that isn't growing right, all knees and wrists, with her hair in 2 ragged plaits and her chin up at an angle I'd later come to know meant she was deciding whether to be afraid or furious. She'd land on furious mostly. The boy was small and round-cheeked still, young enough to think the men in the road were maybe going to do something interesting. He had a wooden horse in his free fist. Somebody had carved it for him and carved it with care. I could see even from the fence that the legs were right, the way a real horse stands, weight on 3 and 1 cocked. Hesh had made that. I'd have bet my saddle on it. You've had fair notice, Marcus Cruz was saying. His voice carried the way a mean voice carries, thin and far. Sarah's gone 2 years, land's mine, was always going to be mine, you knew that. Hesh said something I couldn't hear, low even. Don't, Cruz said, don't you talk to me about her. And there it was, the whole of it in 3 words. Sarah Cruz had married the Apache. That was the unforgivable thing. She died of the same fever that took half the river that winter, and her father had spent the 2 years since deciding that his grief was a debt, and that the man standing in the road would pay it. The county man held out the paper. Hesh didn't take it. After a moment the man set it on the ground, on the frost, with a rock on the corner of it so the wind wouldn't have it, and that small courtesy was somehow the ugliest thing in the whole scene, that they would be tidy about it. "You can take what you carry," Cruz said. "Nothing on wheels. Wagon's mine, the mule's mine, you bought neither." I watched Hesh's hands close on the brim of his hat, just once, then open. Here is the thing I have turned over in my mind more nights than I'd admit. He could have argued. There were people in that county, not many, but a few, who knew the bottomland had been Sarah's free gift to her husband, knew old Cruz had signed off on it himself when she was alive, and he still wanted her to visit. A lawyer in the territory capital might have made something of it, given a year and money Hesh didn't have. He could have shouted. He could have made them feel it. He looked back at his children instead. And whatever was in his face when he did that, I couldn't see it from where I stood. I want to be honest. I have never claimed to read a man's soul across 200 yards of frost. But I saw the girl's chin come up. I saw the boy stop swinging the wooden horse. And I saw Hesh turn back around and start, very quietly, to gather what he could carry. It didn't take long. That's the part that hollows you out. A man's whole life, and it fit on 2 children and his own back in the time it takes to drink a cup of coffee. A roll of blankets. A sack of cornmeal, maybe 10 pounds, that one of the Cruz boys looked at like he might object to and then didn't, which I suppose was that family's idea of mercy. A cook pot. An axe, they let him keep the axe, and I think that was less mercy than the fact that an axe in a quiet man's hand is a thing you let him keep and feel relieved when he walks away with it. A knife. His wife's shawl, which the girl took and folded into her own bundle without being told, and which I never once saw any of them use for warmth, only ever set out at night like a 4th person at the fire. They put it all on. The girl carried near as much as the man. The boy carried the cornmeal sack with both arms wrapped around it and his cheek against it, and Hesh slowed his own steps to the boys so it wouldn't look, to the child, like running. Then they walked, north up the road toward the broken country where nobody farmed because nobody could, past my fence. I should have said something. I want that written down too, in the same small hand as everything else. I had a horse, a full smokehouse, a stove, an empty second room since my wife passed and my own boy went east and stopped writing. I had everything, and I leaned on a fence rail and watched a man walk into winter with 2 children, and I said nothing, because saying something would have made it mine, and I had spent 2 years working very hard to make sure nothing was mine anymore. When they came even with me, the man's eyes found me, just for a step. He didn't slow, he didn't ask. There was no accusation in it that would have been easier. There was just a kind of recognition, the way one tired animal clocks another across a field, and then it was gone, and they were past, and the boy was telling his sister something in a high, small voice about the wooden horse, and she was answering him soft, and they went on up the gray road and around the bend by the dead cottonwood and out of my life. For about 4 days. I want to skip ahead and not tell you about the 4 days, because the 4 days are where I don't come off well. But the whole point of writing a thing down is that you don't get to choose the columns. For 4 days I went about my work. I mended the south fence. I doctored a heifer's foot. I wrote in my book, cold coming, wind from the north, quiet. I did not write family put out on the road, 2 children, did nothing, though I thought it every time I opened the cover, thought it so loud the notch writing of it was its own kind of noise. On the second night, the front came in for real. Not snow yet, just that iron cold that gets into the well rope and the door hinges and the back of your own teeth, the cold that means the easy part of winter is over. I sat by my stove. I have a good stove. I thought about a boy holding a sack of cornmeal with his cheek against it, somewhere out in the broken country with no stove, and I told myself, the way a man tells himself things, that the Apache knew that country better than any of us, that those people had lived through worse than one cold front for 10,000 years before I ever rode in, that he'd be fine, that it wasn't my affair. All of that was true. It is a particular sickness of the comfortable, how much true comfort you can build out of true things. On the fourth day, I rode north. I told myself it was to look at the line shack up in the broken country and see if it was worth fixing before the snow. That was even partly true, but I packed more food than a man needs to look at a shack, and I knew it, and I rode up the gray road past the dead cottonwood with my book in my coat and my heart doing something complicated I'd have denied if you'd asked me. The broken country up there is old Burn. 20 years back, before my time, a fire came down out of the hills and took everything in the upper valley, 3 or 4 homesteads, the timber, the grass, all of it. By the time I knew the land, it had grown back wrong, the way burned country does. Scrub oak in thickets, dead snags still standing gray as bone, and here and there the stone bones of houses nobody rebuilt, because the people who'd have rebuilt them had either burned or moved on or learned their lesson about that valley. It was toward one of those stone bones that I saw the smoke. Thin, careful, the smoke of a fire built small on purpose, by somebody who knew that a big fire is a thing that announces you, and a small fire is a thing that keeps you alive. It rose from behind a tumble of fallen wall and a thicket of scrub oak that had grown up through what used to be somebody's home, and I sat my horse a long minute looking at it, the way you look at a thing when you've finally caught up to the consequence of your own choices. Then I rode in slow, with my hands where they could be seen, and I called out before I came around the wall, because a man with 2 children and an axe and nothing left to lose is not a man you surprise. "Hello, the camp," I called. "I'm alone, I'm not from Cruise, I brought food." "Quiet." Then the girl's voice, sharp and clear and absolutely unafraid in the way that only a child who has decided to stop being afraid can manage. "We don't want it." "Mara," said a low voice. The man's. First time I'd heard it plain. It carried a whole sentence in just her name. "Be still, we'll see. Don't tell a man with food we don't want it when we do." I came around the wall. The camp was better than I'd feared, and that, strangely, was the thing that finally broke something loose in my chest. They hadn't just survived 4 days of building cold. They'd made a place. Hesh had taken the corner of the old stone house where 2 walls still stood and roofed the angle with scrub oak poles and brush and a stretched something. I realized it was the blankets, that he'd given up the warmth of blankets to make a roof, and banked the open sides with rock and earth. There was the small smart fire. There was a flat stone laid by it for cooking. The boy Tay, I'd learn, was sitting on a folded hide working a snare with the gravity of a much older person, and the girl, Mara, was standing between me and her brother with a green oak stick in her 2 hands like she meant it. And Hesh was standing by the fire, very still, watching me with eyes that had done all their crying somewhere I'd never be allowed to see, and were now simply, exhaustedly, taking my measure. "I'm Eli Mercer," I said. "My place is south, the fence you walked past." "I know your fence," he said. That was all, but there was a weight in it. "I walked past your fence. You watched me walk past your fence." He didn't say it. He didn't have to. It hung there in the cold between us, and I understood I had ridden 2 hours to be told, gently, what I already knew about myself. "I brought too much food for one man and a lined shack," I said. "It came out rougher than I meant. It'll spoil. I'd take it as a kindness if you'd let me leave it." It was a lie, and we both knew it was a lie, and it was also the only door I knew how to leave open. Pride is a real thing. A man like Hesh would take charity that called itself charity about as easily as he'd take a beating, but a man can let another man leave food rather than waste it. That's not charity. That's just sense. I'd handed him a way to say yes that let him keep his back straight, and I watched him recognize it, and something in his shoulders let down half an inch. "Tay," he said, "help the man with his sacks." The boy was on his feet before the words were finished, and he came to my horse with his hands out, and he looked up at me and he said in that high, clear voice, "Did you see my horse? My father made him." And he held up the little carved horse, and I got down off my own animal so I could look at it properly, the way the moment demanded, and I said it was the finest horse I'd seen in some while, and it was. The boy beamed. The girl did not lower her stick. We unloaded the food. Flour, beans, a slab of bacon, coffee, a tin of dried apples I'd been saving for no reason since my wife passed. Hesh watched it pile up by the fire and his jaw worked once, and I had the sense of a man doing hard arithmetic. What this meant, what it would cost him in the country of his own pride to accept it, what it would buy his children in days of being alive. I have never in my life watched a sum get worked at greater cost. "Sit," he said finally. "You rode far. There's coffee soon now that there's coffee." It was the closest thing to a joke I'd hear from him for weeks, and I took it like a gift, because it was one. I stayed past dark. I shouldn't have, the cold being what it was for the ride back, but I stayed, and that's how I came to be there when it happened. We'd eaten. The children had fallen asleep against their father in the lean-to, the boy first, then the girl fighting it and losing, her green oak stick still in her hand even in sleep, and Hesh had sat there not moving so he wouldn't wake them with his daughter's head on his arm gone numb, the way fathers do. We'd talked some, low, not much. He told me a little that the bottomland had been Sarah's, that he'd known the day she died her father would come for it eventually, that he'd spent 2 years getting ready to be put out and had still, somehow, not been ready at all. I told him a little back, more than I'd told anyone in 2 years, about the empty second room and the boy gone east. The fire did the thing fires do, where it makes men say true things in the dark they'd never say in the daylight. And then the wind shifted and came down hard out of the north, and the fire flared and bent, and a sound came up out of the ground. Not loud, a breath, a long, low exhalation of cold air from somewhere under us, somewhere below the old burned floor of that stone house, carrying a smell I'll never forget as long as I live, earth, and old wood and apples. Cold stored apples, the sweet-rot perfume of a fruit cellar, rising up out of the ground in the middle of a dead burned homestead 20 years abandoned. Hesh's head came up. I saw him hear it. I saw the whole tired weight of the day go out of his face and something else come into it, something I can only call hunger, not for the apples, but for the thing the smell of apples meant. Storage, shelter, a space under the earth that the fire that took everything above it had passed clean over, the way fire does, leaping the gap, burning the world and sparing the root cellar 20 feet beneath it because fire is stupid and the earth is patient. He moved his arm out from under his sleeping daughter, slow, and laid her head down on the folded shawl that was his dead wife's, and he stood, and he took a brand from the fire, and he went to the corner of the linta where the floor was bare stone and old ash, and he got down on his knees and began, with his bare hands in the freezing dark, to brush away 20 years of burned wood and blown dirt and time. I got down on my knees beside him. We didn't speak. The wind tore at the brush roof. The children slept. And under our hands, slow at first and then all at once, came the edge of a thing, wood, real wood, oak gone black and hard, a square of it set flush into the stone, with an iron ring rusted nearly to lace, half buried, that no one had pulled in 20 years. A door in the ground. Hesh put his fingers through the rusted ring. He looked at me once across the brand light. And I have spent the rest of my life trying to name what was in that look, and the closest I have ever come is this. It was the look of a man who has been falling for a very long time, and has just, in the dark, felt his hand close on something that might be a root growing out of the cliff face. He pulled. The ring held. The door groaned and shifted, and a wider breath came up out of the dark below, cold and sweet and old, and somewhere down in it, faint, the brand light caught the dull gleam of something stacked, something arranged, something a careful, long-dead someone had put away against a winter that never for them came. Behind us, Mara stirred, sat up, found the fire, found her father gone from beside her, found him kneeling at a black square in the ground with a stranger, and a hole breathing up out of the earth where no hole had been. "Father," she said, not afraid, awake all at once and grown 3 years in a breath the way that girl could. "What is it?" Hesh didn't answer her right away. He was looking down into the dark. I have thought since that he was deciding what to call it, Because what you call a thing is what it becomes. He could have said a cellar. He could have said old apples, probably rotted. He could have said nothing, go back to sleep. What he said, after a long moment, with the brand shaking just slightly in his hand, and his other still hooked through that rusted iron ring like he'd never let it go again, was this: "It's ours." And then, quieter, to the dark, or to his dead wife, or to whatever it is a man speaks to when the bottom of the falling finally meets something solid: "It's how we live." He didn't know yet what was down there. Neither did I. We were both about to learn that a door in the ground opens two ways, and that what a winter like the one coming will ask of a man, before it's through, is more than any cellar full of apples can ever pay back. But that's the next part of it, and I find I have to stop here a while and let the fire burn down before I can tell it. The first time I went down into it, I went backward, on the rotten ladder, with a candle in my teeth and my heart in my throat, and I want to set down exactly what I found, because the truth of it was both more and less than the smell had promised, and the difference between more and less is where this whole story turns. It was a fruit cellar, yes, but whoever had dug it for a family that meant to outlast the world. The walls were stone, dry-laid and tight, going down maybe 10 feet to a packed earth floor that was cold as a grave and dry as flour. That's the marvel of it. That's why the fire never found it, and why what was inside hadn't rotted to nothing in 20 years. There were shelves cut into the stone and built out in oak, and on those shelves, under a skin of dust and the husks of long-dead mice, were the things a careful woman puts away in autumn and never gets to open. Crocks sealed with wax and tallow, the wax cracked but the seal mostly holding. Glass jars, a wealth of them, more glass than I had in my own kitchen, because glass was money out here and somebody had spent it. Bins. A whole bin of apples gone, most of them, to a brown leather that crumbled at a touch, but down at the bottom, where the cold sat deepest, a double handful that had only dried, sweet and leathery and good. Onions turned to paper around a few hard hearts that still had life. Potatoes, most rotted to a stink, but seed potatoes, Hesh said, holding one up to the candle, eyes on it, still wanting to grow in the dark and the cold after 20 years. He held that potato like it was a coal he was carrying home. And in the crocks, lard gone faintly sour but lard, cornmeal that the mice and the damp had ruined down to a sour paste at the top, but that was sound, a foot deep underneath. Beans dried so hard they rang like gravel in the jar. A crock of something dark Hesh tasted on his finger and went very still over, and then said one word, sorghum. And I understood from the way he said it that he was tasting a dead woman's afternoon, somebody's mother boiling cane down to syrup in a kitchen that had burned to its stones 20 years ago, and saving it, sealing it, against a hunger that came for her some other way before this one could. But here is the more and less of it. Here is the thing I need you to hold in your two hands, the way Hesh held that seed potato. It was not enough. You hear hidden cellar full of food, and your mind makes it a granary, a king's larder, a thing that ends the worrying. It wasn't that. Strip out the rotted, the spoiled, the gone to leather, and what was left was maybe, 6 weeks of careful eating for one grown man and 2 growing children, in a winter that any fool reading the sky could see was going to be 5 months of teeth. So the cellar was not salvation. I want that plain because it's the lie the easy version tells. The cellar was not the answer. The cellar was time. It was 6 weeks they hadn't had. 6 weeks bought out of the cold, dry dark by a dead woman's thrift. 6 weeks in which a man might do the impossible arithmetic of stretching food and finding more and keeping 3 people breathing until spring. The cellar didn't save them. It gave Hesh a chance to save them. There is a world of difference between those two things, and any man who's been truly poor knows it in his stomach. We spent that whole first day below ground, the 4 of us, hauling up what was sound and culling what wasn't, and it was the strangest day of my life to that point, and one of the few I'd live over if God gave me the choosing. The children changed down there. Up top in the lean-to, surviving, they'd been wary little animals, Mara with her stick, Tay clinging to his carved horse. But put a child in a treasure cave, even a poor one, even a cold one, and the child comes back. Tay found a clay marble in the dust between two stones and held it up to the candle and crowed like he'd found gold. And in a way it was play. It was a thing that wasn't food or fire or fear, and he was rich with it for an hour. Mara found, in a far dark corner, a small tin box, and inside it a child's hair ribbon and a tin whistle and a folded paper gone soft as cloth with a child's drawing on it. A house, a son, a stick family holding stick hands, and she went so quiet over it that her father came and crouched by her, and the two of them looked at that little dead family in the candlelight, the children who had played in this very cellar before the fire, and neither of them said a word. And Hesh put his hand on the back of his daughter's head, just rested it there, and that was the whole conversation. I climbed back up into the daylight near sundown to breathe air that didn't taste of earth, and the world had gone white. The first snow had come while we worked underground. Not a storm, just the front edge of it, fine and dry and businesslike, dusting the burned country and the dead snags and the broken stone walls, and it was beautiful, and it was a warning written in a hand I'd read my whole life. Now the snow said, "It begins now. What you have not done, you will not have time to do." I rode home that night through it, and the cold got into me the way it gets into an older man, deep and slow, and I made a decision somewhere on that ride that I'd spend the rest of the winter both proud of and frightened by. I wrote it in the book when I got home by the stove, with my fingers still too stiff to make the letters clean. Snow. The Apache and his children are alive and have found something, going to help them through. God forgive me, I think I have been waiting 2 years for a reason to be useful to somebody and ashamed of needing one. That's the most honest thing in 50 years of that book. I almost scratched it out. I left it. Now I have to tell you about the work, because the work is where adaptability gets shown instead of said. And Hesh was the most adaptable man I ever knew, and he was adaptable the way the poor and the cast-out have to be, not as a virtue, but as the only alternative to dying. He moved them down into the cellar. That was the first thing, and it was brilliant, and it was hard to watch. A hole in the ground in winter is a terrible place to live and a wonderful place to survive. The earth that kept the food from freezing would keep the children from freezing too, 10 feet down, banked all around by dirt. The cold can't reach the way it reaches a cabin. He built a tiny stone hearth at the foot of the ladder with a flue he cut up through the old collapsed corner of the house. Smart. So the smoke went up through the ruin and scattered through the scrub oak and never made a column anyone could see and follow. He hung the blankets, the precious blankets, to wall off a sleeping corner. He laid hides on the cold floor. He made that grave into a home, and the children, God help them, were warm, warmer than I'd been the night I sat by my good stove and told myself true comforting lies. The second thing was food, and food was where the real war was. 6 weeks in the cellar, 5 months of winter. Do the arithmetic that Hesh did every single day in his head over and over, the way I'd later watch him do it, counting jars with his eyes, weighing the meal in the crock by the heft of his hand, deciding how thin a child can eat and still grow, which is a calculation no man should have to learn, and which the poor learn before they're grown themselves. He hunted. The snarecraft I'd seen the boy practicing was the father's teaching, and Hesh ran a line of snares through the scrub oak and the willow breaks down by the frozen creek, and he was good. He was patient and silent and good, and he brought in rabbits, and a few times something bigger. But hunting in deep winter is a fool's wage. You spend more strength walking the cold than the meat gives back, more days than not. Every man who's tried to live off a winter snare line knows the cruel sum of it. Hesh knew it. He ran the line anyway because a rabbit every third day was the difference, was a margin, was time bought an hour at a time. I helped where pride let me. I brought what I could call surplus and not charity, a quarter of a hog I couldn't smoke in time, a sack of oats, the mice were getting into coffee, always coffee. I taught him my country south of the burn where the deer wintered. He taught me things I'd lived 40 years near and never seen, how to read a willow break for rabbit sign, how to set a deadfall, how the cold itself could be made to keep meat without salt. We were, I think, becoming friends, in the slow, grudging way of two solitary men who'd each spent a long time deciding they didn't need any. And the children grew a little. Not enough, but a little. Tay learned to set his own snares and was prouder of his first rabbit than any man I've seen with any trophy. Mara took over the cellar like a small, fierce queen, rationed the meal with a hand stricter than her father's, learned to make the sorghum, and the dried apples stretch into something the boy thought was a treat, learned to grind acorns the way her father showed her, leaching the bitter out with the cold creek water into a flour that wasn't good but was food, was more weeks, was time. She kept her dead mother's shawl folded at the head of the bed and never once wore it, and I never once asked. For a while, 3 weeks, maybe 4, it almost felt like they'd make it. Like the cellar and the snares and a meddling old rancher and one fierce little girl's arithmetic might add up to spring. Then 2 things happened, close together, the way trouble travels. The first was the deep cold, the real cold, the kind that comes maybe twice in a man's life, that kills cattle standing up, that I'd only seen once before as a young man and prayed never to see again. It settled into the valley like something with intent, and it did not leave for 9 days. The creek froze solid to the gravel, and the snares froze empty, and the rabbits and the deer went to ground or died. And there was no hunting, no foraging, nothing to do but burn wood and eat the stores and watch the margin, the time, the precious bought time, get eaten faster than it could ever be replaced. In 9 days of deep cold, they ate near 3 weeks of careful margin. I watched Hesh quotes arithmetic break against it. I watched a man who'd been winning barely start to lose. He didn't say a word about it. That was almost the worst part. He just got quieter, and his hunting walks got longer and came back emptier. And one night I came up through the snow with the last of what I could spare without my own place starting to feel it. And I found him sitting outside the cellar mouth in the killing cold, alone, looking at the white country, and I sat down beside him, and neither of us spoke for a long time. Mara gave the boy her share 3 days running, he said finally. She thinks I don't see it. She's 11. He said it the way you'd report a death. I have a daughter who is starving herself so her brother can grow, and she does it the way another child would hide that she'd broken a dish. Quiet, so I won't be troubled. I didn't have anything to say to that. There isn't anything. I put my hand on his shoulder, which is not a thing I do, and he let it stay there, which is not a thing he did. And the 2 of us sat in the cold being uselessly, completely, helplessly fathers, me of a boy gone east who didn't write, him of 2 children he could not feed enough. And that was the night, I think, that whatever was left of the Apache died in my head for good, and there was only Hesh, my friend, who was losing. And then the second thing happened. The thing the whole story had been walking toward. The morally heavy thing that I have never told anyone, and that I'm only setting down now because a man my age has run out of reasons to keep his shameful kindnesses secret. The crew's boys found out. It was the younger one, Amos, who saw the smoke. Not a column, Hesh quotes flew was too clever for that, but on a dead still morning in the deep cold, smoke scatters less. And Amos Cruz was up in the burn country running his own trap line, and he caught the smell of it, wood smoke and cooking, where no one had any business living, and he followed it the way I'd followed it, and he found them. I wasn't there. I had it after in pieces from Mara, who'd been at the cellar mouth grinding acorns when Amos Cruz came through the scrub oak with his rifle in the crook of his arm, and that family's particular meanness in his face. He didn't do anything. That's the thing. He didn't have to. He stood there and he looked at the cellar mouth and the scattered smoke and the thin, fierce, starving girl with the acorn meal on her hands, and he understood the whole of it, and he smiled, and he said, Mara remembered it exact. Children remember the words that matter exact, he said. Well, Look what the Apache dug up. Pa's gonna want to know about this." And he walked off to tell his father. Because here is the part that the deed and the county paper hadn't covered, the part that meanness always finds. The cellar was on Crew's land. The whole burned country, all the abandoned homesteads, every stone wall and every hole in the ground 20 feet beneath them. It had all been bought up cheap by old Marcus Crews years back, the way men like him buy up cheap land nobody wants. Against the day it might be worth something. The bottom land they'd put Hesh off of, and the burned country they'd driven him into, were the same man's property. Hesh had fled his way deeper onto the land of the man who'd cast him out, and the one thing keeping his children alive was, by every law a county recognized, Marcus Crews's apples in Marcus Crews's cellar in Marcus Crews's ground. Hesh came back from his snare line to a daughter telling him they'd been found. And here is where the morally heavy thing falls, not on Hesh but on me, because I was the one who had options. Hesh had none. A starving Apache squatting on a white man's land in that county had exactly as many choices as the county allowed him, which was none. But I was Eli Mercer, who owned his own place free and clear, who had standing, who had a vote and a name, and 40 years of being a known quantity to lean on. I could go to Marcus Crews. I could buy the cellar. I could buy the apples, the burned acre, the right for a man and 2 children to keep breathing through till spring. I had a little money. Not much. Enough, maybe, if Crews would sell it all, which he might not, out of pure spite, and if he would, the price would be everything I had and likely my good name besides, because a man who pays to keep an Apache alive in that county becomes himself a kind of Apache in the eyes of his neighbors. I knew that. I'd watched it work on Sarah Crews, who married for love and got buried by her own father's grudge. Or I could do nothing. Again, the way I had on the fence rail. I could let the law and the Crews family take their course, and tell myself it was their land and their right and not my affair, and keep my money and my name and my place and my good stove, and live out my remaining winters comfortable and known and alone, and only have to look at one more thing I hadn't done, in a life that had become a long, quiet column of things I hadn't done. I sat in my house that night with the book open, and the pen dry in my hand for a long, long time. I want to tell you the choice was easy. It wasn't. I'd be lying, and the whole point of the book is that it doesn't lie. I am not a brave man. I am a careful man who got one chance late to be braver than he was. And I sat at my own table for hours measuring the cost of it against the cost of being the man who watched from the fence twice. What I finally wrote in the book near midnight was 4 words. I'll tell you what they were, but I have to tell you in the next part, because what I did with them, and what it cost, and who paid, and the thing that happened with Marcus Crews that nobody in that county ever knew the truth of but me, is the heart of the whole matter. And I find again that I have to stop and let the fire burn down before I can say it. The snow was still falling when I closed the book. Down in the cellar, 10 feet under the burned ground, Mara was grinding acorns by a small fire, and her brother was asleep with a carved horse in his fist, and their father was sitting at the cellar mouth in the killing cold with a rifle across his knees, awake, watching the white country for the men he knew were coming. He was not going to run again. That much I'd understood from the way he'd taken the news. A man can only be thrown out so many times before something in him decides that the next ground he stands on is the last, and he will not be moved from it. And the cost of moving him will have to be paid in a currency that men like Marcus Crews are usually too comfortable to spend. I knew, riding up there the next morning with 4 words and everything I owned, that I was riding into the place where this would be decided. I told you I'd tell you the 4 words I wrote in the book at midnight before I rode up there with everything I owned. Here they are. They aren't fine. I'm not a fine writer, and I wasn't a brave man, and the words match both of those facts. I will not watch. That was it. That was the whole of my courage, set down in a hand that shook from the cold and from the rest of it too. I will not watch. Twice in my life I'd had the chance to be a man instead of a witness, once at a fence rail, once at my own table, and I'd spent the first one and I was not going to spend the second. So I rolled my money into a sock and I saddled up before light, and I rode into the worst sky I'd seen in 30 years, because of course the weather chose that morning to make its real move. Of course it did. The cold had only been clearing its throat. What came in behind it that day was the thing the old-timers called a blue norther, and it came fast, and it came mean. And by the time I reached the burned country, the world was going the color of a bruise, and the wind was starting to lift the dry snow off the ground and throw it sideways. I was not the first one up there. The crew's wagon stood by the dead cottonwood, the mule stamping and miserable in the rising wind, and the three of them, old Marcus and his two grown sons, were already strung out across the snow between the wagon and the cellar mouth. And Hesh was standing at the mouth of the cellar with his rifle, not raised, not lowered, just held, in the way of a man telling you the price of the next 10 feet without saying a word. Mara was behind him, in the cellar doorway, with the boy's hand in hers. I rode in between, which is a foolish place to ride, and I'll tell you my heart was going like a drum, and I got down off my horse with the sock of money in my fist, and my voice not nearly as steady as I'd practiced. "Marcus," I said, "don't do this, I'll buy it. The acre, the cellar, whatever you say it's worth, I've got," and I held up the sock and I heard how small it sounded even as I said it. "I've got money. Name a price. Let them be." And old Marcus Cruz looked at me, really looked, the way you look at a man you've known 30 years and are seeing for the first time as a stranger. And what he said cut deeper than I was ready for. "You," he said, "Eli Mercer, 2 years your wife's in the ground and you've not said 10 words to a living soul, and now you'll spend your whole stake to keep this." He didn't have a word ugly enough, and you could see him reach for one and not find it, to keep him breathing on my land. What's he to you? And I opened my mouth to give him some reasonable answer, some answer about decency and the Lord and what's right. And what came out instead, in front of the crew's boys and the rising storm and God, was the true thing, the thing I hadn't even let myself know until it was in the air. He's the only friend I've got left. The wind took it and scattered it, but they heard. And Marcus Cruz looked at me with something I couldn't name then and have spent years nomming since. It wasn't softening, it was worse. It was envy. The raw envy of a man who has driven off everyone who ever loved him and is standing in the snow watching another man admit he's got one friend and finding that he himself can't say the same, and his face closed up and he said, "No sale. Get off my property. Both of you old fools, boys." And then the storm hit for real. I have lived through weather. I am a rancher. Weather is the country I farm. But I have never before or since been in anything like the white that came down on us in the next few minutes. It wasn't snow falling. It was the air itself turning solid and white and screaming, the temperature dropping so fast you could feel it on your teeth, the visibility gone from a mile to 100 feet to your own outstretched hand in the time it takes to tell it. The mule screamed. Hesh's rifle and Marcus's pride and my sock of money, all of it, in an instant, became exactly as worthless as the storm decided everything was worth, which was nothing, which was less than nothing, because the only currency left in the world was shelter, and there was exactly one shelter on that whole white screaming acre, and it was a hole in the ground full of a dead woman's apples, and it belonged, in the only law that mattered now, to no one but the cold. Inside, I was shouting, everybody inside the cellar now. And here is the thing I will carry to my own grave as the truest thing I ever saw a man do. Hesh got there first. Of course he did, it was his door, his children were in it. He could have pulled it shut. He could have, with perfect justice, with the blessing of every law of man and nature, taken his 2 children down into the one warm safe place on earth and pulled the oak door closed over their heads and let the men who threw him out freeze to death in the storm not 40 feet away. No one would ever have known. No one would ever have blamed him. The cold would have done it, not him. He'd have been 3 feet underground with his arms around his children, while the men who broke his life turned to ice in the wind. And it would have been fair. It would have been the most perfectly fair thing this story could possibly end on. He held the door open. He stood in the screaming white at the mouth of his own salvation, and he held the door open and he shouted them in, the man who'd cast him out, and the sons, and me, waving us toward the only warmth in the world with the same hand that, 10 minutes before, had been deciding whether to shoot. Down! Get down! Old man, move, you'll die out here. Mara, the fire, build it up. We piled into the cellar like animals into a burrow. Marcus first, because Hesh near threw him down the ladder, the old man cursing and stumbling and too cold already to do anything but obey. Then the elder son, Caleb. Then me. And we got to the bottom and got the door pulled shut over us, and the screaming of the world went suddenly, blessedly muffled, and there in the candlelight and the small fire's glow, 10 feet under the burned ground, the 7 of us, no. 6 of us. Amos wasn't there. The younger son. The one who'd found them, who'd smiled and said, "Look what the Apache dug up." When the white came down, he'd been farthest out, near the wagon, trying to hold the panicked mule, and in the first blind seconds he'd done the thing the storm wanted him to do. He'd let go of the cellar in his mind and grabbed for the wagon, for the team, for the thing that felt like getting away, and the white had swallowed him whole. Marcus knew it before the rest of us. A father always knows the math of his own children, even when he's a hard man, even when he's the worst man. And he came up off the cellar floor with a sound I'd never heard a grown man make and lunged for the ladder, to go up, to go out, to walk into the white screaming death after his son. And he'd have died in 100 feet, the way Amos was dying, and there'd have been 2 of them out there for the spring to find. Hesh pulled him back. Pulled him down, held him, this old man 4 times an enemy, held him the way you hold a child having a nightmare, and said, close to his ear so it would land through the panic, "You'll die. You will die and not find him, and your other son will bury too. Sit down. Sit down. I'll go." And the cellar went quiet, even the fire seeming to hold its breath. Because everyone in that hole understood at once what had just been offered. He'll go. The man they came to drive off or kill. He'll go out into the thing that's already killing Amos Cruz, to bring back the son of the man who buried Hesh's wife's gift and threw his children into the snow. He'll spend his own life, the life his 2 children needed, the only father they had, on the worst of the men who'd wronged him. "Don't," I said. I grabbed his arm. I'm not proud of it, but I grabbed his arm. "Hesh, your children, you can't let him." He looked at me. And then he looked at Mara, at his daughter, who was kneeling at the little fire, who had stopped, who was watching her father with her whole starved, fierce heart in her face. And something passed between them that I wasn't part of, a whole conversation in a half a second, and what I understood from it after was that he wasn't doing it in spite of his children. He was doing it for them. Because he was the kind of man he was, and the kind of man he was the only thing he had left to give them. He'd lost the land, the wagon, the mule, the future, every single thing a father is supposed to hand down. The only inheritance left to Hesh's name was who he was, a man who held the door open, a man who went out into the white for his enemy's son. And he was going to leave them that, even if leaving it to them meant leaving them, because a daughter who watches her father do that grows up knowing what a person can be. And that is worth more than apples, and it is worth more, God help us, than staying alive. He took my coat, I gave it. I tore it off and gave it. It was the one useful thing I did all day. And he took the coil of snare line and tied one end to the ladder and the other around his waist. The oldest trick there is, a thread back to the world. And he kissed the top of his daughter's head and put his hand for 1 second on his sleeping son's hair. And he went up the ladder into the storm. And the door closed. And we waited. I will not stretch out the waiting. There is a kind of writer who'd milk that hour for every drop, and I find I can't because I lived it. And living it was not a story. It was just an hour at the bottom of a hole listening to a rope, watching it go slack and go taut, slack and taut. while a hard old man wept into his hands, and a frightened son held the fire, and a starving girl gripped her mother's shawl. She'd taken it out at last, after 2 years, and wrapped it around the sleeping boy. And I sat there holding a sock full of money that the cold had taught me was worth exactly nothing, and prayed in a way I hadn't prayed since my wife died, which is to say without any words at all, just please, 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 over and over, into the dark. The rope went still. For a long, long time the rope went still. And then it jerked and jerked again, the signal, pull, pull, and we hauled on it, all of us, even Marcus, hauling on a frozen line through a square of screaming white. And what came down the ladder was 2 men so caked in white and so far gone that for a heartbeat I couldn't tell which was which. A single frozen creature with 4 legs, and we got them down and got the door shut and got them to the fire, and started the slow, terrible work of bringing the warmth back into bodies the cold had near finished. Amos lived. He lost 2 toes and the tip of 1 ear, and he was never, I'm told, quite the same kind of mean again. There is a thing that happens to a cruel man when he wakes up warm and alive and is told who carried him there, and it is not redemption. Redemption is too clean a word, but it is something. It is a stone in a shoe he'll feel for the rest of his life. Hesh lived too, but the cold took the price it always takes for being cheated of a death it had counted on. It took the last 2 fingers of his right hand, the hand that carved the horse, the hand that set the snares, the hand that held the rifle and then held the door, and it took something out of his chest that never fully came back, a rattle in the breathing in cold weather that I'd hear in him for years after, every winter, a small cost paid forever for 1 hour in the white. The storm blew 3 days. We were down in that cellar 3 days, the 7 of us, eating a dead woman's apples and cornmeal and Mara's bitter acorn flour, and there is no neat way to tell you what those 3 days did, packed into a grave together. The men who'd been ready to kill each other over an acre, kept alive by the very thing they'd been fighting over and by the man they'd been fighting against. I'll tell you only one thing about the 3 days, and then I'll stop, because it's the thing that mattered. On the second night, Marcus Cruz, who had not spoken since his son was carried down, sat across the little fire and watched his granddaughter. Watched Mara feed the boy first, the way she always did. Watched her grind the acorns. Watched her tuck her dead mother's shawl, his dead daughter's shawl, around her sleeping brother. And the old man's face in the firelight, 10 feet under the ground that was his own and that had become, for those 3 days, no one's and everyone's. The old man's face came apart slowly, the way a frozen creek comes apart in the spring, with cracks and then with sound, and he put his ruined old head in his hands and he wept for his daughter, 2 years too late, in front of the children he'd thrown into the snow, and the man who'd lost 2 fingers saving his son. And Hesh, gray-faced, his bandaged hand in his lap, his breath rattling, Hesh watched his enemy weep for the woman they'd both loved. He didn't forgive him. I want to be careful here because the easy version of this story has Hesh forgive him, and Hesh didn't, not then, maybe not ever, and he was right not to. Forgiveness wasn't his to hand over cheap to make an old man feel better, but he did one thing. He reached across the fire with his good hand, his left, and he set it on Marcus Cruz's shaking shoulder. The same gesture I'd set on Hesh's shoulder in the cold weeks before, the gesture that passes between men who have nothing else to give, and he let it stay there. And the old man wept harder because that was worse than forgiveness, that was mercy, and mercy from a man you've wronged is the heaviest thing there is to carry. That's all, that's the whole reckoning. There was no signing of papers down in that hole, no grand reconciliation, no speech. There was an old man crying and a wronged man's hand on his shoulder and a fire burning low and a little girl pretending to be asleep so the grown men could break in private. The storm broke on the 4th morning. We climbed up out of the ground into a world scoured white and silent and so bright it hurt, and the mule had died in its traces by the wagon, and the world was new and terrible and very, very quiet. Marcus Cruz gave them the bottomland back. Did it proper, with the county man, a week later, signed it over to Mara and Tay outright so no spite of his sons could ever undo it after he was gone, which wasn't long. He died the next autumn, the heart. And I'd like to tell you he died at peace, but I don't believe he did. I believe he died with the stone still in his shoe. And I believe that was the most honest thing his life ever managed. So they had the land back. The good bottom land, the daub and stone house Hesh had built with the hands the cold left him. The story should end there. Thrown out with nothing, they got it all back and more, they got the truth of who they were. That's where you'd end it. But that's not where it ended, because Hesh didn't stay. I rode over in the spring, the real spring, when the bottom land was greening up and was his again free and clear, to find him loading what little they had onto a cart. A cart Marcus had given them, a horse I'd given them, the last gifts of two old men trying to pay down debts that don't take money. The children were saying goodbye to the place. Mara was digging up something from beside the house, bulbs, her mother's flowers, to take with them, and Tay was sitting on the cart with the carved horse, and a new one beside it that Hesh had whittled with 2 fingers gone, clumsier but a horse, still standing weight on 3 and 1 cocked. You won it back, I said. I couldn't keep it out of my voice. Hesh, you won. Why would you leave it? And he looked at the bottom land a long moment, the green of it, the house, the ground that had been Sarah's gift and her father's grudge and the children's birthright, and the place his whole life had broken apart. Because it's hers, he said, and his. It will always be hers and his. My children will grow up on it being the place their mother died and their grandfather hated them and a man froze his fingers off. I'd rather they grow up somewhere that's only theirs. He looked at me. A man can be given back everything he lost, Eli, and find that getting it back is not the same as having it. I didn't have an answer for that. I still don't entirely. I've turned it over for years. They went west. There was land out there, he'd heard, a valley, a chance. The things a man hears, the things that keep a man's feet moving. Mara hugged me fierce once and called me by my name and not the rancher. And Tay gave me one of the carved horses, the older one, the one that started it all, and I have it on my mantle to this day where my wife's picture used to be alone. And Hesh shook my hand, my right hand with his left, because his right couldn't any more, and we held on a moment longer than men do, 2 solitary men who'd spent a long time deciding they didn't need anyone and had been proven wrong by a hole in the ground and a killing winter. Then the cart went up the road, north and then west, past my fence, past the fence where I'd watched them once and done nothing, and around the bend by the dead cottonwood, and the boy was telling his sister something in a high, clear voice, and she was answering him soft, and they went on, and around and gone. I never heard from them. A man like Hesh doesn't write. He was never anywhere with a post office, most like, never anywhere with a name. So I don't know if they made it to the valley. I don't know if there was a valley. I don't know if the rattle in his chest let him see another winter, or if Mara grew up fierce and free somewhere with her mother's flowers blooming by a door that was only theirs, or if Tay still has the horse, or if any of it came out the way a man would want. I tell myself it did. I sit by my good stove in the winters now, an older man than I was, alone the way I chose to be alone before a cold morning taught me better, and I take down the book, and I read the forewords I wrote at midnight all those years ago, and below them the long, uneven entries that followed, the hand getting worse, the truth getting better. And on the mantle the carved horse stands, weight on 3 legs and 1 cocked, the way a real horse stands, the way a man stands who is tired and will not yet lie down. There's a door in the ground up in the burned country still, empty now. I rode up once to look. The apples are long gone and the shelves have rotted and the iron ring has finally rusted through, but the stone holds, dry and cold and patient, the way the earth is patient, keeping nothing now but the dark. It kept 3 people alive once. I like to think it's still up there, waiting, in case the world ever throws somebody else out with nothing.